Filtration 1. This is the first in our filtration and clarification series for EV205. And I just want to talk about what clarity is. And so, why does it matter? And the reality is it's consumers. People have no idea what's in their wine. We have been greenwashed to death, and people just don't understand that a little sediment in something can be a good or a bad thing. So even though there is a market for unfiltered and unfined wine, it's a pretty small amount. Pretty much unfiltered wine makes up a tiny bit of the wine market in general. If a wine's going to be distributed, distributors don't want to deal with, and it's even getting worse now that the distributor consolidation has gotten so bad that basically they don't want to deal with wines that might have potential microbiological spoilage issues. They don't want to have to go back for wines that have issues. It's not even worth it for the broader market. Now, if you're a small self-distributed outfit that's can explain the virtues of your unfiltered and all the sediment and yeast in the bottom of your bottles, then fantastic. And your consumers are into that, then go right ahead. But again, that's a pretty small amount of the overall wine industry. And so another thing to think about here too is that there are 58,000 current SKUs on the shelf. And this is for wineries that actually have barcodes on the back of their wines. So when you think about that for a second, that there are 58,000 different choices for wine is spectacular to think about. So to put that in perspective, I think number 2 is t-shirts. And there's 17,000 different kinds of t-shirts available. So that means there's almost 4 times as many choices for wine as there is for t-shirts. But to give you an idea of this too, back in 2015, they almost broke 100,000 certificate of label approvals. That means that there were 100,000 different wines just approved for sale. So the reality is there could be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of choices for consumers. And when they go to buy a wine from you and there's a bunch of sludge in the bottom, they're going to make sure to tell everybody about it. And the joys of social media today, they'll be really quick to put that out there. And again, if you have the right market and you sell it right, fantastic. But in the grand scheme of things, having some pretty clear wine is important for the consumer. So the question is, how do we measure clarity? And the degree of clarity we actually should be using is a turbidimeter. And a turbidimeter is a really simple instrument. You simply put the wine in a clear tube and insert it against a standard of clean water. And that'll tell you how dirty or clean your wine is, how visually clear it is. So our units of turbidity are pretty simple. The main one that we use are NTUs. Some people say it's national turbidity units, but really it's nephelometric turbidity units. Also used to be known as Coleman-Neflos turbidity units, but apparently the Neflos won and they became nephelometric turbidity units. It's a fun word to say if nothing else. Then there's also some other ones that are European brewing convention rules, but generally NTUs are the standard measure. And here's how we measure it. It's pretty simple to measure NTUs. There's a lamp and there's a lens, and what happens is there's scatter detectors that are looking for light that's, instead of going straight through the sample, are bouncing off to the sides. And if there's light bouncing off, that means it's reflecting off of something, and whatever's reflecting off of it is what's going to give it that rating. So this is about how they work. But again, a very simple measure, not terribly different than how your eyeball works. You know, you look at it and you can see through it. It's clear. And so the question is, how clear is clear? And so if you were to measure a sample in a turbidimeter, this is about what it would look like. And I think this is a really good example of some work that we did this last fall. And when we did these, I actually ran this particular setup to ETS Labs, and it kind of went right across the gamut. So the control was actually a little closer to 10 NTUs. And then as we moved to the right, our 0.25 was about 5 NTUs. And then we were about 5 again with a 0.5 milligrams liter. Then we were at about 4. And then we were about 3. And then finally, the one on the far right, the 1.25 grams per liter edition, we were at 0.05. So we were right at that brilliantly clear level. And this is that bentonite edition. that we did this fall, and I think this might have been Sauvignon Blanc. We'll have to, or Simeon, I don't remember. You guys will have to tell me. But I do remember the test, and it was really perfect. So this is about what haze looks like across a range. So to keep things really simple, I want to talk about ways that we can achieve clarity in a really simple way. How do we get the white wine clear? Because before we filter a wine, or before we want to move to that point in time, we have to get the wine pretty clear. And so the thing is that if the wine's still got a lot of turbidity in it, it's going to make filtration more difficult later on. Filtering really dirty, unclear wine puts a lot of pressure on whatever type of filtration unit you're going to use. So the idea is to get the wine pretty clear first off. So one way we want to do it is with white wine is we want to remove dissolved CO2. So dissolved CO2 is really good at keeping things in suspension. It's really good at keeping yeast floating and things like that. So one of the first things we like to do is do a quick racking. And if we're doing this on white wine, racking, you've got to be very careful. So adding inert gas on either side, making sure the tank's been evacuated, things like that. And then once you do get that racking done, especially if you're using CO2 as your blanketing gas, come back in and sparge with nitrogen, and you'll find out that that wine will start to settle pretty fast. And when I say sparge with nitrogen, using one of the diffusion stones like we used when we macro ox. The other thing we can do is stir the lees. So stirring the lees initially causes cloudiness, so it seems counterintuitive. But when you stir the lees enough times, it starts to create nucleation points to degas the wine. So just the act of stirring helps. The other thing it does is as the yeast start to break down, they release these things called mannanoproteins that go in and coat tartrate nuclei and other things like that. That actually brings a little bit of stability to the wine. So just that little act of adding some stirring helps to clarify white wine. So initially it sounds strange, but after you do it for a little bit of time, that wine will fall clearer faster. And then also bentonite, which we've been over in 204 to remove that excess protein. So generally what we like to do is get that in as early as possible and then perform any of the other actions that we need to get that wine to settle out. But this is just some easy ways to achieve clarity just using gravity. And these are just sort of the key tools involved in getting that clear. Now, in red wine, basically, in red wine, you'll see that the main mechanism of action for getting red wine clear is through racking. And traditionally, this has been achieved depending on the facility by racking the wine a number of times a year. So that racking process removes that dissolved carbon dioxide as well. And you'll find that wines that are a little higher in tannin tend to clarify easier. So wines that like Cabernet, Merlot, they tend to have quite a bit of backbone to them, and those tannins help to force precipitation to happen a little bit quicker. Whereas you might notice some of the lighter bodied wines, College Cellars Carmenere would be a good example of this, but so would the Grenaches. They can be particularly difficult to settle in general. Just they suspend solids really well. So the hard part with those more delicate wines is you don't want to rack them very often because you don't want to get oxygen to them. But at the same time, you sort of need to move them in order to get those yeast to fall out. So some of the techniques used in white wines, which is why we see some stirring in reds to help that degassing process and to help those solids settle a little bit more easy, does help. The question is, how often should you rack? And that's really a stylistic choice. You know that I'm not a big fan of racking unless I absolutely have to. I don't like to touch the wine. But and because we do have a crossflow that's pretty robust and can handle some pretty decent solids, we don't tend to rack a whole lot. But if you're going to be an unfiltered winery, one of the things that needs to happen is that wine needs to be racked pretty regularly. And you will change the aromatic profile of wine pretty significantly the more often you rack, especially if you introduce oxygen. Some wineries rack up to 6 times a year. It's pretty traditional to do that in Bordeaux. And then there is the more modern style, which is running a little closer to reduced and keeping those aromatics in the wine and allowing those wines to age for a little bit longer. What's the right answer? Well, to be honest with you, there isn't one. It just depends on the approach to your wine. The less you rack the wine, the more fruit driven it's going to be, the more fruit forward it's going to be. The more often that you rack, you're going to start to notice other things that come forward, losing some of those primary fruit estery type of things that you get from the non-rack. And you will also end up losing a lot of sulfides. That there's a lot of wineries that tend to like to rack a lot to mitigate sulfide issues. So it sort of depends on your style. So if you want that little bit more closed down, structure-driven wine that's really showing off your oak profile and not showing primary fruit, but just kind of showing that background structure, rack a whole lot. If you're looking more towards a fruit-forward, aromatic style of wine, i.e. Willamette Pinot Noir, a little bit less racking is a positive thing, because that's going to allow you to maintain those aromatics in a wine that doesn't have a lot of tannin to hold on to the structure. So just some quick tips for clarity, and we'll move on to part 2 now with filtration. Well, actually, so the thing is that in order to get here, clear isn't necessarily clean. So the idea here is that filtration is the only option that you have to get a wine completely clean. So we could put this wine in a turbidimeter, because they're very small cells and it looks like there's a whole lot there, and we probably get a pretty low reading as to how turbid it is. It would look pretty clear. This would be a wine that we would see as pretty clear. This is a commercial wine. But the reality is, just because something looks clear doesn't mean it is. And so filtration needs to take out some of these microbes that you just can't see. And we see this very frequently, where we see these wines that are brilliantly clear, but yet you run a scorpion panel on them and notice that there's still quite a bit of bugs in them. And I would tend to think this wine was completely unfiltered, being that it was never run through any type of a filtration unit. Either that or something decided to grow in the bottle. But anyway, it's a really high scoring, very high quality wine. Tastes great. So these things, if you didn't know they were there, you wouldn't care. But nonetheless, if you're going to be distributing this wine and there's a bloom specifically of Pediococcus, and that number continues to crank up, this wine could start to get mousy in bottle and kind of start to develop some off flavors. At this point in time, it doesn't have any, but the conditions could change in the wine, and suddenly you've got Pediococcus blooming in bottle, and you have a wine that tastes mousy, and then a distributor has to perform a recall, which is expensive to go send people out to get the wine. Then you're going to have to pay them to do that. Then you're going to have to bring the wine back and decide what to do with it. Again, if you're a small producer and the only person that's going to get called when that wine's bad is you go right ahead. But if you're working in a large winery capacity where you're sending out millions and millions of bottles of wine all over the globe, a global recall becomes very, very difficult. And so, again, we live in small winery la land where we get away with some of this stuff. But in bigger wineries, you just can't risk it. And especially when the price point is that you're making 25 cents a case on the wine, all said and done, it could be a very difficult process, and very costly and very detrimental to the winery's reputation if they have to do a recall. And this is why filtration is such a valuable tool.